You're watching Beyond Market. Welcome, I'm Esther Awuni. On today's show, we'll deliberate on ways to plug Nigeria's infrastructure deficit. As always, you can join the conversation with the hashtag Beyond Market. You can follow my Twitter handle too, at Esther Ubudaga. Now, Nigeria recently asked the World Bank Group and the International Monetary Fund for help to improve results on its renewable energy targets. Now, infrastructure is still a major challenge for Africa's largest economy, from energy to roads. So how can Nigeria plug its infrastructure deficit? Eme Essien Lore, country manager for the International Finance Corporation, a member of the World Bank Group, joined me to discuss this. So Nigeria's infrastructure deficit, it's not news. We've talked about it since I became a journalist over 10 years ago, we've been talking about it. But let's talk about the progress we've made in the last 2 years when we had a new government. We appear to have a renewed focus on deciding what our problems are and how the approach to solving them. And infrastructure was number one on the table. So for you, from the IFC, what would you say has changed in the last 2 years?
Well, I think first of all, we do have a committed government, a government that has recognized the need to focus on the policy dimension of the infrastructure issue, right? So we think that this is a critical point. And the last 2 years, it's been, I think if you look at it, we would say we'd like to have seen much more progress. We closed, a number of investors closed the first generation project post the public sector reform project, which privatized all the discos and the gencos. That closed about 2 years ago, just under 2 years ago. And the expectation was that we would have seen more specifically on power in terms of new generation capacity. That hasn't happened. But what has happened is the sector has actually gone through a pretty challenging time, such that we are at a point where you have government, you have all the stakeholders in government, you have the development community, you have investors saying we're at a critical moment, we have to do something about it. And that now has resulted in this power sector recovery plan, which the government has put forward as the way to solve the power sector challenges. So what's happened is that the sector has gone through quite a bit of a beating because of the macroeconomic situation, the challenges in the Niger Delta. All these things have really, really challenged the sector. And as a result, we're almost at a cliff, such that this plan has been put forward. And it is a comprehensive way to address what we see as a pretty significant issue in the power sector.
Okay, now still in the power sector, which obviously was a good place to start, because we keep hearing fixed power, you fix a whole lot of other things that get them up and running. So the Azura Power project, that was a very good example. That was a success story, if you will. So I'm thinking, it's over. Why can we replicate that? Can we build more momentum? If you tell investors that success story, it will sound like a good place to start.
It's a great place to start. I think, though, when you look at Azura and you look at when Azura happened, there was a real need to demonstrate that Nigeria was a destination for investment capital for infrastructure. So we had to make the case globally that investors should put their money in Nigeria. So Azura was structured in that way. Over time, if the policies are right, then what you should see is government having to put less support towards the sector. So over time, the government can sort of slowly back away. Government support, though, is still critically necessary for the power sector in Nigeria for all the reasons that I mentioned. And so what we won't see is necessarily a replication of Azura, but we'll see projects really building off of what we think were quite successful about Azura. And there are many dimensions of that were successful. You have to remember, all these projects are different. They all have their different idiosyncrasies, so they'll be structured differently. But Azura was structured as the first project. So everything that follows on from that will build from that and hopefully borrow from that and hopefully be structured in even a more effective and efficient way. The challenge, though, is that we haven't seen much happen after Azura. We would have liked to have seen much, much more activity in the investment space.
But what message do you think that sent to investors? I imagine quite a number of them would probably have been very nervous. We all know that there is that potential in Nigeria, even in the infrastructure space, regardless of all the challenges. But I know that for many investors coming in, it's still a very big risk. So many questions asked and very few answers provided. But for the Azura example, do you think that it sent a different message of sorts to investors?
So I'll just I always remind myself of this, because the Minister Fashola always reminds us that the electricity power sector in Nigeria is still very new. It's still almost a baby that's crawling. The sector really, obviously the sector's been there for a long time, but in terms of this current phase, It's still very new. So in some ways, we should be impatient because the need is urgent. You know, the average Nigerian needs power for schools, for their homes, for their businesses. It's urgent, no question about it. But at the same time, this is a massive opportunity for Nigeria, and it's not something that's going to move very quickly. So in some ways, we should be a little bit patient, but impatient at the same time. So my sense is that, you know, we're on the right path. There have been some setbacks. We had, you know, tariffs, an increase of tariffs right before the last election, and then the announcement made, and then the reversal happened very quickly after that. So investors obviously would look at that and see sort of signaling that is not very positive. But frankly, the Nigeria opportunity for investors is very big. So they will be patient to see what happens over the next few years. There are no short-term opportunities here. Everything here is taking a medium to long-term perspective. So they will be patient. We will be patient as we see the sector evolve.
Patient capital for it.
Absolutely.
But you know, you mentioned that reversal in tariffs. I personally thought that was a very, very big setback. I mean, because if I'm an investor and the government has come and say, you know, I mean, we put everything, the policies are here, we've made the environment very conducive. Come and put your money and watch it grow. And you know, but then I mean, what I need to recoup my investment, one of the tools I need is taken away. I mean, cost-reflective tariffs is part of why, for the discos, and we know that that's one of the biggest challenges they have today. So if that is not resolved, I'm wondering, that also sends another kind of message to investors in terms of the kind of support they can expect or not expect to get from the government when that kind of issue comes up. Because I know that labor unions were involved. I mean, even the National Assembly stood behind the reversal. So when you have those kind of big groups behind that kind of a policy, reversing it, what do you do as an investor?
Well, I think what's different now is that with the power sector recovery plan, there's been quite a bit of consultation with the private sector, with various stakeholders, with the development community. So it wasn't, if you look at it, the plan envisages tariff increases over time quite gradually, okay? So there's a recognition that you have to get to a cost-reflective tariff. There's no question about that. The only question is, when you start and how long does it take? So in developing the plan, there was quite a bit of consultation. So it wasn't a, sort of unilateral view. Okay. That consultation happened and a recognition that, we need a financially sustainable sector. And if we're not getting paid, if the sector's not getting paid for what they're producing, it's not sustainable. So that recognition was there. And so you're right, at the end of the day, people look for political commitment for tough decisions. And so that will happen again. We will arrive at a moment when there's that question about what's the political commitment to moving forward with something that people will have, obviously there'll be almost a visceral reaction to because it's such an important issue. But it's important for all the stakeholders to stay the course.
Are you optimistic that this time around we would have the right amount of political will to push the needle from policy to implementation?
I do. I mean, I think in Nigeria we have to stay very optimistic. But the other thing I want to say is that, tariffs it's not the silver bullet. I think oftentimes people talk about it as if you address tariffs, then you address the sector. There's so many other issues that need to be addressed. There are governance issues. There are technical issues. There are delivery issues. There are a whole host of issues across the entire ecosystem. Tariffs are just one piece of it. So I wouldn't want people to think that that's the issue about the Nigerian power sector. It is one of them. It needs to be done very carefully and thoughtfully. But if you don't address these other issues as well, then we'll be right back where we started.
Interesting. Now let's talk more about funding, but maybe not just for the power sector. And I know that the IFC has launched a series of bonds. My mind goes back to the 5-year Niger bond that you launched in 2013, quite successful. Mm-hmm. And you said then that there were multiplier effects. And so I'm thinking, give us an update. I mean, the bond matures next year, 2018.
Yes. So that was our inaugural issue. We called it the Niger Bond. So it was really an opportunity for us in not just Nigeria, in a number of African countries to get a sense of really what the appetite would be for a local currency bond in our market. So yes, it was successful in many respects. In part, we worked very closely with the SEC and the other regulators, and we've seen the collaboration that we have with the regulators in this market, I think, is very strong. All of the market infrastructure that's necessary for strong capital markets development exists in Nigeria today. I don't think there's anything that we're missing here. What has happened, though, is that we've had a period of time when interest rates have really been quite high. And so the appetite for local currency bonds has, from an investor perspective, even some of our clients, they question, do they want to raise money in Naira or do they want to raise money in foreign currency? That appetite for more local currency lending we're seeing grow. After our Niger bond, AFDB issued as well, and we are now preparing for a Naira bond program. So we'll be able to issue over the course of several years, depending on what our pipeline is and what we see, to our clients who want to fund themselves in Naira. So we're very excited about that because our very strong belief is that you cannot have sustainable development if you don't have sustainable local domestic capital markets. You have to have local savings, funding, investment. You can't just rely on foreign investment. You have to have a significant base of local savings to fund investment, and that's where the capital markets come in as an intermediation. So we're very excited about it. We think it's going to really be an opportunity to attract additional investors to Nigeria. So not just local investors, but other investors into Nigeria. And yes, we're very excited to see the Sukuk was very successful. That's something that we can consider, as well as the green bonds as well. So there's quite a bit to be excited about.
Okay, we'll talk about. I want to talk a lot more about the Sukuk, but for this Nigeria, what do you say to investors who say that look, this bond they're less liquid compared to government bonds, and I'm just thinking, looking at the environment, there's still risks to the environment, and I know that for those category of investors, they could be at more of a risk to market shocks. So isn't that a concern?
So the question of liquidity doesn't come up so much. I mean, at the end of the day, the investors that are attracted to an IFC issue in domestic currency are attracted to the long-term nature of it. So when we issue, we're going to be at 7-10 years, if not longer.
Is that a senior?
Yes. Typically. So we will. That's really the attraction for investors who are looking at IFC issues. Okay. So liquidity doesn't. Obviously it is always a concern, but in the Nigerian environment, it's not something that we are concerned about. I think we will have a lot of investor interest once we go to the market. So in terms of the attractiveness of government bonds, obviously that's there. You need to have a strong investor base in the government securities in order to provide an anchor for corporate debt as well. So it's very important that you have that anchor there, and then the rest of us, whether we're the supranationals like IFC or a local company wanting to raise a bond here, they can anchor themselves around that. So we all have to sort of work in tandem. But obviously the govies are the most liquid, but I think there are many different investor classes. So we're not concerned about attracting the right type of investors for our.
All right. If you're just joining us, we are discussing ways to tackle Nigeria's infrastructure deficit. We continue the discussion with Eme Essien Lore, Country Manager for the International Finance Corporation. Let's talk about the Sukuk bond. Nigeria has dipped its hand into the Sukuk market, 100 billion naira so far, and it's for road constructions. And I'm thinking, I hear experts say, look, the Sukuk market is one that holds so many opportunities, and Western economies use it too. And here it looks like we're just playing catch up. But obviously we've started. So what are your thoughts on Nigeria going into the Sukuk bond market, and what other opportunities should we be looking to tap?
Well, first of all, why did it take us so long, frankly, right? The Sukuk really provides an opportunity for Nigeria to raise money and to target it towards infrastructure. That's really where the value is from an investor perspective like IFC when we're looking at development impact, to really target and monitor that those funds are going to those specific projects. So hopefully the door is open for the government to do a lot more Sukuk fundraising. My understanding is that there's excitement about using the instrument in the future. So we'd like to see that. We have, as IFC, have done Sukuk in different markets. So we would certainly explore the opportunity to do it here as well, very much so. So I think it is really the right tool for Nigeria to be focusing funding towards infrastructure.
Would you say it's the best for a country like Nigeria, because there's so much, the deficit is so huge, and we're obviously playing catch up, and we need patient capital, but we also need to move as fast as we can. So would you say that the Sukuk market, non-interest, is the best for a country like Nigeria?
I think you need a range of tools. You need a diversity of tools. So Sukuk is one. There's the green bond, that's another. There's the traditional lending program. You need to have a complete set of tools in your tool chest and use them effectively. I think the question is going to be, how does Nigeria really engage with their investors to really ensure that there continues to be strong investor appetite for Nigeria. That is going to be the critical issue. And in fact, I think it's very important to have diversity in different instruments so that we can diversify the investors who are looking at Nigeria today. Right now, if you look at a lot of the investor flows that have come in since the introduction of the investor and the exporter window, quite a bit of that has been in portfolio investment, right? We need to see much more in terms of FDI. So diversification of the investor profile is going to be critical for Nigeria going forward.
But what do you think that says about our economy, or perhaps how foreign investors perceive the economy? I mean, we're having all this money, over 90% last time I checked, in just in the portfolio bonds, treasury bills. When it comes to FDI, the numbers were quite low, and I'm wondering, how do we get that skill to shift?
So it's not a huge surprise that it's a little bit slower to pick up. At the end of the day, portfolio investors come in and out, right? So it's not surprising that FDI has picked up a little bit more slowly. We'd like it to be a bit faster. We'd like to see that. Over the next, let's say 6 months or so. I mean, at the end of the day, we're in a new regime. We're in sort of a new normal for Nigeria. And most investors say to us, well, let's see how it goes. It's still too early to take a view. People need to see exits happen as well. So there's one thing to bring your direct investment in. There's another thing to have no issue with repatriation, with loan payments, et cetera. And that is really also, that history is building up as well. So once you see more track record, you'll see more FDI follow as a result of it.
So but then, sorry to butt in, but that's a lot of people. That's a lot of investors folding their arms and sitting on the fence and saying, let's just wait and see. And let's just let that other guy go and do it and see if he comes out okay before we come and bring our money. So I'm thinking, doesn't that also contribute to the whole slowing down that we continue to see?
So we're in the category of FDI, and I won't characterize us as sitting down and folding our hands. And the reason why is because it takes quite a bit of time to really fully assess projects and to get to a point of funding. So from all the investors that we've been engaging with, they are all actively looking at projects. And the great thing is that they're actively looking at projects in pretty much every sector. There's interest. So, it is happening. It's not, sort of a deluge at this stage, but it is absolutely happening. We are actively looking at projects across a number of different sectors. And my expectation is that by the early part of 2018, you'll see a lot of those efforts really come to fruition. So assuming that we don't have any major macroeconomic shocks. Now that's a pretty big assumption. Plus the political, and that's another dimension. That's another dimension that is very, very important. But let's just, in the realm of sort of the exogenous, the stuff that we have no control over, assuming that we don't have any major shocks there, then I think the trend is you'll see much more foreign direct investment coming alongside. I'm pretty confident of that. With respect to your point about sort of the political situation in 2018, everybody's asking me that question: what's going to happen? What's going to happen?
Because that's political risk now that they add into the list of risks. Okay.
The biggest risk is that there's slowdown. Projects that should move forward stagnate or move very, very slowly. That's the biggest risk we see. It could be worse than that, obviously, but really, as you've made the point, we can't afford to wait any longer. We have urgent needs. To have 2018 as a year of slowdown instead of a year of momentum would be unfortunate.
I know that, power obviously is very critical, and you've talked about IFC, looking at the number of projects, and I like your enthusiasm and optimism as you look from sector to sector. But what are those sectors, like major sectors, that you're looking into? And I know that IFC is doing housing in West Africa, but I'm thinking, is Nigeria on that list? Just give us an idea of what's happening with housing.
So let me start with sort of the manufacturing side. Okay. There's a lot of potential for companies, industries in general, that are focusing on the bottom of the pyramid. So what we've seen is that when you have a macroeconomic shock to an economy like Nigeria, we want to look at the sectors that are most resilient. And the sectors that are most resilient are the sectors that can support and fund and provide services and products to the bottom of the pyramid. The average Nigerian who needs certain services and certain products, and they're just they're gonna move towards that. So we've seen a number of companies that have been able to address that need. So that's so you would think you can look at downstream petroleum as an example there. Really anything in the FCMG space is interesting, and we're looking at a number of those opportunities. So then you mentioned housing. It's a critically important sector here. There's a 17 million housing deficit or something like a huge number here. That sector will continue to be challenged. I think that the Ministry of Finance has come up with a new concept. I think they formed a company actually now to really address the housing deficit issue in Nigeria. It's still at the early stages, but it's taking off. The question will be, how do you attract private sector investment to that at scale? So both on the supply side, supply of affordable housing, and on the demand side, mortgages, et cetera. So there are a number of issues there. I think we were pleased to see that there's been some start, but the question mark for us will be, how do you attract private sector investment? There's no way that government can do this on their own. Absolutely need to have private sector investment.
Okay, but from a policy perspective, from the government, obviously government needs to get things going with policy. Would you say that, is that what we're still trying to get right? And we have to get that right before the money comes?
So I don't think there's much of an issue on the policy side.
Okay.
I think the issue really is, one, the interest rate environment. Okay, right. It's still quite prohibitive to get a mortgage in Nigeria. For even a salaried employee to have a mortgage, it's quite expensive. The tenors are very short, so they have to pay a lot in a very short period of time. And that's just the interest rate environment in general. And then so that's on the demand side. On the supply of affordable housing side, we have yet to see, there are developers in this market that are very good, but really to operate at scale. At scale means thousands and thousands of units, not hundreds and hundreds of units. So that we haven't seen yet. So it's not a policy issue, it's more of an environment issue. And remember that in Nigeria, this is all sort of devolved down to the states, right? So each and every state can create their own initiative around how they want to address housing. What we've seen is that when states are interested in moving forward, oftentimes the area they've identified is very far away from an industrial node. You need to have something that's close by, or they haven't really catered for bulk infrastructure. So all of these issues, and it's case by case. I think in the Nigerian situation, we need to see something really successful happen, and once something successful happens, then others will follow suit. But we do see a lot of potential in the housing sector, but again, how do you attract investors?
So, I mean, you're saying, I mean, waiting for something to happen, that takes us back to that waiting game again. But we know that a large part of the story also for us going forward will be in the public-private partnerships. But then the model also comes into question, what models are we using will be successful? What models have we used in the past? Because I know many have failed in the past. I mean, the airports are one example, but we know that the airports have now been concessioned. But then, of course, the PPP model. But what are your thoughts in terms of how Nigeria hasn't been able to get that right? And perhaps what we're doing differently now, or what we should be doing differently now? Maybe looking at similar economies to get it right.
So if I were to pick one thing, and by the way, in the PPP space, you know, different countries have different models, and you have to have a model that, you know, it's very country specific. So I'm not sure that there's one solution for it. But the problem we've had in Nigeria is when you look back on our PPP history, it's been it's you know, we've had a number of failed PPP projects, and that in and of itself is the biggest problem. So you start a PPP process, and then, you know, for some reason, it falls apart. So that's the biggest issue, consistency. You start and then you complete, and these are projects that are going to be 10, 15, sometimes 30-year projects. So to start a process and not let it go the full course really does send a very negative signal to investors. In terms of the overall model, I would say, you know, the relevant agencies here have the ability to really come up with a model that works. What I think we would like to see is ownership at a very senior level, and we're starting to see that. You know, ownership at a very, very senior level to say, this is the model that we're going to pursue, and this is the only model we're going to pursue, and everything has to fall in line behind that. And then just kind of beating that drum every single time, this is the model. And every time there's a question mark or a court case or something like that, that model, you know, it stays put. And that type of senior level commitment to a particular path, I think, is going to be the solution for the PPP sector.
Okay, so having a template, perhaps, of some sort that works. Well, now, finally, we have about 2 minutes left. Pension funds. We've consistently talked about pension funds. Right now, for Nigeria, roughly around somewhere around 6.7 trillion. That's a huge, huge amount of money. But of course, they're very protective of that fund for obvious reasons. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's money that people have worked for. So I'm thinking, how can we, in a way that is safe, in a manner that is safe, harness this fund?
So this is a big question, and people often say, well, you know, pension funds should do more in the infrastructure space, but pension funds haven't even gotten to their allocation of infrastructure, right? So it's not a policy issue. We're not talking about policy here. The policies they look fine, at least on paper, at least for the time being. The issue is, do you have the right products for the pension funds to invest in? And with those products, have you mitigated the risk sufficiently? So pension funds they're not going to take construction risk. They're not in the business of taking that kind of risk. They're going to take sort of, you know, market operational risk going forward, but not construction risk. So we are seeing a bit of innovation come into this market, which is exciting, that I think hopefully will start to provide that intermediation. You have InfraCredit that's been set up by the Nigerian Sovereign Investment Authority, which basically wraps these projects with credit enhancement so that the pension funds can invest. So that's just taking off. You have infrastructure funds set up as well, debt infrastructure fund set up by one of the private firms here. So there's a lot of potential and a lot of innovation there to see intermediation of pension funds into infrastructure. But it won't be a rapid process. It'll take some time in order for the skills, the comfort level to grow over time.
Eme Essien Lore, IFC Country Manager for Nigeria.